Hello ladies and gentlemen of the internet. Welcome to what will be the last piece in the King of the Rusted Crown mold making saga. This is until we start casting him, of course, but for a while now this will be the last you'll see of the king, hopefully. And this time we'll open the mold. Just a quick note on the future of the channel before we begin. I'm gonna try and upload once a week for the next month or two and see how it affects the channel, the traffic, all that good stuff, all the analytics stuff. So look forward to next Thursday, because then we'll begin the 3/4 version of PT. So a new project next Thursday, stay tuned for that. Let me know what you think about this move, this schedule change in the comments below. I'd love to hear some feedback on this and your thoughts, so let me know. As always, I'd like to invite you to check out my Patreon page if you would like to support me in making videos, or if you would like to learn how to sculpt. There is rewards for helping out as well, so check it out. There's a link in the description below. So the most important thing when opening molds is to recruit some friends. And as you can see here, 3 people make short work of a mold like this, and it saves a lot of time having other people around. So here I have Odal Deowana and Octavio Palomino helping me out. Octavio is a former fellow student and now one of my students, and Odal is a former fellow student, former instructor, and a former colleague. And he's worked a lot in hydroresin, in this material that the mother mold is made in, so he's very familiar with how tough it is. So you can see he's using a hammer and a chisel to get the pieces apart. He's hammering at the seams in between the pieces of the mother mold. Now if this was a plaster mother mold, that would be impossible. The mother mold would break. Plaster is not strong enough. Maybe if you let it dry out for a while, but you'll have to wait quite a while to make that happen. Another reason, and this is another reason why I've fallen in love with this material, it's extremely tough and it makes life so much easier. You don't have to worry about pieces of your mother mold breaking, or if he's chiseling them off and they fall off on the ground, it's fine. But if it was plaster, that could potentially be a disaster. Now, most of these pieces came off pretty easy. The last piece was a bit difficult. It's not the best made or placed piece, so it's a little bit undercut. So I ended up spending some time with a rasp and a Dremel to sand down some of the sharp corners and soften it up a little bit to help with demolding. Now, in this case, in this video, we have clay inside the silicone, so it's not a big deal. Clay will move when you and get squished, of course. And it doesn't really matter because the clay sculpture is going to get thrown away anyway. But if you have a cast inside of this, a resin or a wax cast, or anything else that you would like not to be destroyed, it can make demolding quite difficult. So I cleaned up the piece off camera a little bit to help with demolding in the future. And I did this with most of the other pieces too, just soften up some sharp corners just to make sure they don't cut the silicone or anyone's hands for that matter. Okay, so here I am cutting apart the silicone of the hands. It's not so easy to see because the hands are quite a difficult shape to cut, so I needed to move it around quite a bit to get into all the weird angles and to make it work. And I think I forgot the camera was on here. I didn't mean to film this, which is why I'm off in the right corner. I'm using 2 knives to get this job done. A regular box cutter knife or an X-Acto knife or any other sharp knife would work as well. And what's called a mold cutter knife. And this is a special knife with a bend in it. So when you cut into the silicone, it creates a negative and a positive. So when you try and put the 2 pieces of your mother mold, of the entire mold back together, they register well and they don't slide around. See, if the silicone was just cut with a smooth knife, with a straight knife, you'd get 2 straight sides and it can deregister and not line up perfectly. And you'll see this more clearly once I cut the silicone on the body. Once the mother mold is off the silicone, I clean it up with a rasp and sandpaper before reassembling it. I spend a lot of time making sure there are no sharp areas on my mother mold because this mold will likely be handed off to somebody else to make a wax cast for a bronze casting one day. And the last thing you want is for someone to cut themselves on your mold. And because this material is so hard, and a plaster would more or less be the same thing, I've cut myself on a mold like this before, and it was a pretty bad cut on my shin. Whoever handles this will have a job where they work with their hands, right? So the mold will be handled, and the last thing you want is to injure somebody else or yourself so they can't do their job anymore. Now, cleaning this up is pretty slow going. The material is super hard, but with a sharp rasp and sometimes a little Dremel tool or any other, like an angle grinder or something like that, and you can make it work. It's really worth it. It makes the mold so much more usable. So we're back to cutting the silicone. You'll be able to see the knife I use right here, and later you'll be able to see what the cut looks like as well. You can see I have a black Sharpie line drawn on the knife, so I know how deep to cut. You want the registration, the positive and the negative, to be in the middle of your silicone wall, not too close to the surface of your sculpture or too close to the surface of your silicone. So a little Sharpie line helps me keep track of how deep the cut is. I'm also very careful to make sure the cut happens in the middle of the silicone wall. If I drift off to one side or the other, I can cut through the wall, which would be a disaster. So I pay close attention to how deep I'm cutting, that I cut in the middle of the silicone wall, and to make sure all that happens, I keep the knife 90 degrees to the wall, so the cut goes straight down, so the thickness of the silicone wall is even from the top to the bottom. I take my time with this because it's a crucial step, and if you mess this up, it's really hard to fix, unless you have silicone glue, which I don't have here in my studio in Italy. And without it, it might be almost impossible to fix. So be very careful on this step. Once the first cut with the mold cutter knife has been made, I make a second pass with my box cutter knife. And this last cut is for the last bit of silicone that's close to the surface of the sculpture. Because the mold cutter knife will a lot of times not reach the surface, right? Because I try to keep I follow the black Sharpie line on the knife, and sometimes it doesn't reach all the way down to the surface. And the same thing goes for this cut with the box cutter knife. I cut 90 degrees to the wall to make sure I don't cut through the side of the wall. And this doesn't have to be one even cut like the first one, but you have to be careful that no piece of the silicone gets cut off, which would be very bad for registration. So I make smaller movements, small cuts when cutting with the box cutter, and it will actually give you more registration. It creates this kind of ribbed look inside the mold, which gives you more registration. In some areas, the mold cutter knife will have reached the surface, but in others there might be quite a bit of silicone to cut through to reach the surface. So I try to stay patient, work very slowly, and keep my hands away from the cutting edge of the blade. I've seen this, it makes sense, right? You know, you hold your hands behind where the blade is going, but I've seen people not do it, and sometimes the knife will slip out of the silicone and you can cut yourself pretty badly, so be careful. It's also very important to not pull and rip the silicone while cutting. Where you've cut the silicone, it can very easily happen. You've already cut it, and so the silicone will rip easier in those areas. But you want to make sure that the silicone is not cut, you want to make sure that the silicone is not ripped, but that it is cut. So, while pulling the two pieces of silicone apart just a little bit will help you with the cut, and that's okay. You don't want to pull too much because then the silicone starts ripping, and that's not good for registration, and the cut tends to drift off when you do that, so be careful. A tip for you that I didn't do here, but you can do if you want to, is to paint wet clay slip all over your silicone before starting with the mother mold. And the reason you do this is because it creates a bit of a barrier between the mother mold shell and the silicone, and it fills out some of the small bumps and lumps in the silicone, so the mother mold won't grab on as much to the silicone. It helps with the molding. It shouldn't create any difficulties with registration between the mother mold and the silicone later on, as the clay slip is very thin. Once the silicone has been cut all the way through, all around, you can take the silicone off. This is another time when the silicone could potentially or is likely to rip if you're not patient. So be very patient and peel it off a little at a time. Because we've used paste silicone, we can never be 100% sure of the thickness of our silicone, or if we've trapped air bubbles, and if there's a difference in the strength in some areas of the silicone, it's likely to rip where it's thinner or where there's air bubbles. So you have to be careful to not pull too hard. And so here is the sculpture revealed once again, even though it's somewhat compromised, but the king is back and he's alive for now. Next step is to clean the silicone, and I thought it would be fun to take you guys for a quick trip from my studio through the student studio and into the lab, where we make armatures, we store things, casts and stuff, and we clean our silicone skins in the sink. Cleaning the silicone is pretty straightforward. Clay sticks a little bit to the silicone, and this does depend, somewhat at least, on how dry the clay is once the silicone is applied. And you can spray your clay with some clear acrylic spray or something like that to help keep the silicone a little bit cleaner during the molding. But I rarely do this, and I just clean my silicone with soap and water. A stiff brush for cleaning dishes is very useful as well and makes quick work of getting the clay off of the silicone. Also make sure you rinse the silicone well, otherwise the dirty clay water that you just washed out of your silicone will just dry on the silicone and your efforts will have been for naught. Also take notice that I put the silicone back into my mother mold right away. The silicone can and it will distort if it's left laying around on its own without the support of the mother mold. So I always put it back in the mother mold right away, and I never leave it laying around. When I store the mold, I prefer to leave them laying open so the silicone can't collapse in on itself, and I cover them with some plastic to make sure they don't get super dusty. Once all the work is done, after spending months and hours, probably close to 300 hours, we finally have to, or get to, depending on your disposition, take the sculpture apart. Now I find this somewhat satisfying. It's like saying goodbye and accepting that the fate of your original sculpture is to die. It's a little sad as well, of course. But it's good to get it over with quickly before the clay dries out too much and getting it off becomes a lot harder. And I try to save as much of the armature as I can, so I can reuse it in future projects, save some money. And the clay is put in our clay bin and sent off to be recycled and comes back to us as fresh clay in new bags to get used in the future for new exciting projects. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page to lend your support to the channel. If you'd like to learn directly from me how to sculpt, then the Patreon page is the place to go. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about tools, techniques, sculpting, mold making, casting, whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several tiers, which gives an array of rewards, one of them being maquettes, skulls, or pieces of this very sculpture. So check it out, and I'm sure you'll find something for you. The link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for next Thursday and the beginning of the 3/4 scale version of PT. Subscribe and hit the bell to get notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. This helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.